November 21, 1962. Deep beneath the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea, a Soviet B-59 submarine silently lurked, just a few kilometers away from the American coastline. Hidden under the surface, armed with a nuclear torpedo and ready to strike. But above the waves, the U.S. Navy had already picked up its signal. To force it to surface, American destroyers began dropping small depth charges, warning bombs, into the water. Inside the submarine, thousands of kilometers away from Moscow and completely cut off from communication, the Soviet captain believed the worst had happened, that war had begun. His finger hovered over the nuclear launch button. One single order, and the world as we know it would have ended that day. This was the height of the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a terrifying standoff, each holding enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet many times over. The tension had been building for years. After the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world had seen what nuclear power could do, and nobody wanted to face that again. But the Soviets, determined to match America's power, tested their own atomic weapons and made it clear: we are not Japan. We will not bow down. From that moment, both sides kept their nuclear arsenals on constant alert, ready to launch from land, air, or sea at a moment's notice. By the early 1960s, the U.S. had deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, both NATO allies, and dangerously close to Soviet borders. This gave America a huge strategic advantage. In response, Soviet leader Khrushchev decided to even the score by secretly placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles south of Florida. To America, Cuba was already a problem. After the revolution led by Fidel Castro, Cuba had embraced communism, something Washington could never tolerate so close to home. But to Khrushchev, Cuba was the perfect location, a communist ally within striking distance of the U.S. mainland. In a secret deal between Khrushchev and Castro, the Soviets began installing R-12 and R-14 ballistic missiles on Cuban soil. No one in the U.S. knew. That is, until a U-2 spy plane flew over the island and captured photographs that confirmed America's worst fears. Soviet nuclear bases were being built just a short flight away from Miami. When President John F. Kennedy saw those photos, he was stunned. Within hours, he met with his top advisors to decide how to respond. The U.S. military pushed for airstrikes on the missile sites, followed by a full invasion of Cuba. But Kennedy knew one thing: if the U.S. attacked Soviet missiles in Cuba, Moscow would see it as a direct act of war. A nuclear exchange would be inevitable. The world stood on the brink of World War III. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, that Soviet B-59 submarine, armed with a nuclear torpedo, had gone silent. It had been ordered to stay hidden near Cuba, awaiting further instructions. But communication with Moscow was lost. Inside the sub, temperature soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen was running low. The crew was exhausted and paranoid. And then, explosions. American ships began dropping small depth charges to signal the sub to surface. To the Soviet crew, those weren't warnings. They sounded like war. Inside the sub, tense dialogue narration. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed World War III had begun. He decided to launch the nuclear torpedo right at the American fleet above. But before he could, Soviet protocol required the consent of all 3 senior officers aboard. 2 agreed, 1 refused. That man was Vasily Arkhipov, the executive officer. Arkhipov argued that they had no confirmation from Moscow, no proof that war had started. He urged the captain to wait, to surface, to make contact before taking an irreversible step. After a heated argument that lasted minutes, but felt like eternity, the captain relented. They surfaced. and the world was saved. At the same time, secret back-channel negotiations between Kennedy and Khrushchev began. A deal was struck. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. Privately, Washington also agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy within a few months. The world exhaled in relief. For 12 days, the planet had been on the edge of total annihilation, a crisis that history now remembers as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Historians later revealed that both countries had even readied nuclear weapons in space, set to detonate if the war began. Thankfully, it never did. The B-59 submarine eventually returned to Soviet waters, and the man who stopped the launch, Vasily Arkhipov, would later be called the man who saved the world. If Arkhipov had stayed silent, if he had agreed with his captain that day, we might not be here to tell this story. A single man's courage in the heat of confusion prevented a nuclear war and saved humanity. This is the story of the day the world almost ended, and the man who stopped it. If you found this story fascinating, hit like, share it with someone who loves history, and don't forget to subscribe to Think Matter for more stories that make you think.